Merry Christmas and welcome to the Henrietta Christmas Quilt Block. This is a foundation paper piecing pattern. I'd like to introduce you to Henrietta, our chicken, and Moo, our cat. They're best buds. Down in the description below, you'll find a timestamp for different sections of this tutorial. Print out your pattern, copy your unit's pages, and cut out each unit. There is a section called Helpful Tips, and you'll want to follow those so that your pattern will turn out correctly. Okay, now that we have cut out each unit, we're going to use our reference page to help us label each section within each unit. This helps so that as you cut out your fabric pieces, you can make sure that you have the right fabric piece for the right section. Units A and B in the pattern are templates, or you can use the measurements that are on the pattern to cut your fabric pieces out. Now that our paper units are cut out, let's move on to rough cutting our fabric sections. I like to work from the largest section down to the smallest section, and I will also do all of the same color of fabric first and then move on to the next color. You'll notice that because the sections are labeled, it makes the rough cutting process move much more quickly. For this part of the chicken, I have all of my rough cut fabric pieces cut out. I want to make sure that I have all my fabric in the right order that the pattern calls for, so that as I take it to the sewing machine, I am confident that I've got the right fabric piece for the right section. Again, here's a smaller unit, and I'm going to put all of my fabric piece in the right order. We're going to start with our first unit. This is the top of the chicken where the tail is. First thing we do is use our cardstock, line it up on the line, and fold. Here I'm double checking the order of my fabric sections so that as I take it to the machine, I've got the right fabric with the right section. I'll take my section 1 fabric, line it up with my section 1 on the paper pattern, fold on the line between section 1 and 2, and I'm going to trim 1/4 of an inch away from that fold. I folded the pattern at the beginning so you can see section 2 folds on the pattern. Here's my section 2 fabric. Now I'm pointing to my folds so that I know where to line up my section 2 fabric and take it to the machine. Back stitching at every black dot, and then we're going to take it to the iron and iron section 2 fabric back. Next, we'll fold back the line between sections 2 and 3, give us 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Grab our section 3 fabric, take it to the machine, and back stitch at the black dot. And then iron section 3 fabric back. We will repeat the same steps until our unit is complete. Every time you add a new fabric piece, make sure to iron that piece back. Now that our unit is complete, we'll line our ruler up with the paper pattern line and trim 1/4 of an inch around the entire unit. Our next unit is the Beak unit. We're going to make sure our fabric is in the right order. We're going to grab our cardstock and fold on our paper pattern line. Taking section 1 fabric, we'll line it up with our section 1 on the paper pattern, fold over the line between section 1 and 2. Make sure we have 1/4 of an inch seam allowance with our fabric. Take section 2 fabric, line it up with that 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, and take it to the machine, making sure that we backstitch at every black dot. And we'll repeat that process until we have completed the entire unit. Now that we have completed this unit, we'll line up our ruler with the line on the paper pattern and leave 1/4 of an inch seam allowance all the way around the unit. This unit is the chicken head with the comb. First thing that we'll do is grab our cardstock and fold on all the lines. You'll want to make sure that you go in the order that the pattern calls for. We're going to take our section 1 fabric and line it up with the back side of the fabric on the back side of the paper pattern. Fold over the line between section 1 and 2, make our 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, line up our section 2 fabric, and take it to the machine. Remember to backstitch at every black dot so we can reinforce that seam when we pull off the paper pattern, and iron every time we sew on a new piece of fabric. We're going to our next section. We're going to trim 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, add our section 3 fabric, and take it to the machine. After we finish sewing, we want to take our fabric piece to the iron and press it back. We're going to repeat those steps until we finish adding every fabric section to this unit. You'll notice that each unit has the sewing line going through the seam allowance. You want to make sure you follow that on this unit because of all the smaller pieces. We want to avoid those flaps when we decide to sew unit to unit. Okay, we've completed this unit. We're going to turn it over, line our ruler up with that 1/4 of an inch seam allowance line, and trim all the way around the unit. This unit is a smaller unit. There are 2 units that are the same, so I'm just going to do one of these for the tutorial, but there are 2 of these that you'll have to do. The first thing that we need to do is grab our cardstock and fold on every line. Next, we'll take our section 1 fabric, back of the fabric to the back of the pattern, fold on the line between section 1 and 2, cut our 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, line up our section 2 fabric, and take it to the machine. Once we sew that section fabric on, we're going to take it to the iron and press it flat. Again, we're going to fold on the next line, cut our 1/4 of an inch, line up our section 3 fabric, and take it to the machine. Remember to backstitch on every black circle. Next, we take it to the iron and press that section flat. Repeat those steps until you have every section of fabric added to your paper pattern. Once you've completed your unit, line up your ruler on the 1/4 of an inch seam allowance line and trim all the way around your unit. This unit is the top of the wreath. The first thing we're going to do is fold on every line of our paper pattern. We're going to take our section 1 fabric, make sure it's covering our section 1 on our paper pattern, fold over between lines 1 and 2, line up our fabric, making sure that we have a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, line up our section 2 fabric on that 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, and take it to the machine. Once we're finished sewing section 2 fabric on, we're going to take it to the iron and iron it flat. Next, we're going to fold on the next line, line up our ruler so that we have a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, and then take our section 3 fabric and line it up, and then take it to the machine. Once that fabric is sewn on, we'll take it to the iron and iron it flat. Now that our unit is complete, we'll turn it over, line up our ruler on that 1/4 inch seam allowance line, and trim all the way around the unit. This is the first time that we're going to turn this over and tear off the paper unit. You'll notice I use my one thumb to stabilize near the seam, and I use my finger to tear off the rest of the paper pattern. With all of the paper removed, we're going to sew unit to unit. Now these are exact, so you can trust that if you line up your units corner to corner, you should be safe and everything should line up just right. One small tip when sewing your units together is to keep that left finger next to that sewing foot so that you can keep pressure on your fabric as it runs through your sewing machine. That looks nice and lined up. We're going to take it to the iron and press that seam open. Again, we're going to take our next unit, line it up with the bottom of our wreath, corner to corner, take it to the machine, and sew. Again, you'll see my left finger next to that sewing foot supporting that fabric and making sure that that seam stays straight and that my fabric runs straight through the machine. Again, when we take this to the iron, we're going to iron that seam open. Now we're going to take our unit B, line it up corner to corner, and take it to the machine. Next, we're going to take the rest of our chicken units and tear off the paper pattern. Notice that I keep my left thumb next to the seam while I tear with my other hand. Using your visual instructions, attach the units together in the order given. Okay, here's our final product. It looks good and everything looks precise. Our next unit is the tree with the star. The first thing that we do is grab our cardstock and fold on all the lines. For this tree, I'm not going to do every unit because they're repetitive. So if you'll watch this unit, all the rest of the units will be the same. We're going to take our first fabric for section 1, line up our second fabric, make sure we have 1/4 inch seam allowance, and take it to the machine. Remember to backstitch at every black dot. After we sew, we're going to press back section 2 fabric with the iron, fold on our line, cut 1/4 inch seam allowance, and line up our section 3 fabric, and then take it to the machine. Once we've sewn section 3 on, we're going to take it to the iron and iron section 3 flat. Fold on the next line, cut 1/4 inch seam allowance, line up our section 4 fabric, and take it to the machine. Next, we're going to take our section 4 fabric to the iron and iron it flat. For the rest of this unit, the steps are repetitive, so I'll let you watch as we finish this unit. Now that this unit is complete, we'll use our ruler, line it up on that 1/4 inch seam allowance line, and trim all the way around the unit. Next, we're going to tear our paper pattern off, making sure that our left thumb is by the seam supporting that and tearing with the other hand. Now that our units are complete, let's sew them together, lining up corner to corner, keeping that left finger next to that sewing foot, stabilizing that fabric as you run it through the machine. Our next unit is the top of the star. Again, this is repetitive, so I'm not going to do all of the units of the star. We're going to grab our cardstock and fold on every line. Next, we take our section 1 fabric, line it up, fold on the line between section 1 and 2, take our section 2 fabric, line it up on our 1/4 inch seam allowance, and take it to the machine. After sewing, we want to take it to the iron and press it flat. Next, we're going to fold on the next line, trim to 1/4 inch, Next, take section 3 fabric, line it up on that 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, and then take it to the machine. Remember to backstitch at every black dot. Now that we're complete with the unit, we're going to take our ruler, line it up on the 1/4 inch seam allowance line on the paper pattern, and trim all the way around the unit. Our next unit is the side unit of the star. First thing we do is grab our cardstock and fold on every line. Next, we'll take our fabric 1 for section 1, line it up, cut a 1/4 inch seam allowance, add our section 2 fabric, make sure we have that 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, and take it to the machine. After sewing section 2, we're going to take it to the iron and iron it flat. Now that we've completed this unit, we'll turn it over, line up our ruler on the 1/4 inch seam allowance line on the paper pattern, and trim all the way around the unit. Now we're to the point that we can sew our unit of the star together. Here's what the star looks like when it's all sewn together. And here's adding your star to your tree. And to finish it off, we'll add the top to the chicken and then the tree to both the chicken and the top. And here's our Henrietta quilt block.